part 3 of this 22RE engine swap with a beautiful motor from Yota1 Performance. You're going to see us installing the new motor in my 85 4Runner. We're going to put some more parts back on the engine like the distributor, and we're also going to put in a new flywheel, new clutch, new pressure plate, new throwout bearing, and a new pilot bearing. That's all going to take place in this part. And then you're going to see us getting this motor started with some fresh startup oil, and I'm going to drive home happily to San Jose, California with a sweet new engine from Yota1 Performance. Let's get started.
Okay, so here we're gonna show some of the clutch components and talk about a couple of the differences and what we're gonna be doing. We're doing a new motor, so obviously we're installing a new clutch kit and a new flywheel. If you're doing the engine swap, I recommend you do both. At least a resurface flywheel. It doesn't really have to be new. In this situation, we're going from the 8 7/8 clutch setup to a 9 1/4, so we have to replace the flywheel. So here's an easy way to ID between the two different flywheels. This is the 9 1/4, and you can see this face of the flywheel comes out flush with the edge of the gear. And on this 8 7/8, you can see how this face is stepped back from the gears. There's nothing wrong with it. This is just a bigger, better setup, so we're gonna switch to that. We're also gonna update the release bearing. This is the old style release bearing, uses these loose clips. With this style of bearing, you have to retain this piece. You would press this bearing off and retain this piece and install the new bearing. We found a lot of people weren't doing that. So this is a direct replacement, and this is the newer style complete release bearing that doesn't require any press work. You would get rid of all those pieces, and this has the clip built onto it. This is a way better way to go. This kit's gonna have the pressure plate, the friction disc, a pilot bearing, the alignment tool. This would be an addition. The kit actually comes with that bearing, and we're gonna add this. We're gonna reuse the flywheel bolts. They're in good condition, but the pressure plate bolts are gonna get replaced with new OEM bolts. That's part number 90919-08079. 6 of those. So now let's show you how to put this on the engine. Okay, so now we're going to install the backing plate, and you'll remember these super low profile bolts with the one washer. Remember, you're gonna wanna use these here. So this just simply sets on over the back of the engine. This engine uses 2 of these. A lot of them do only use 1. Doesn't matter, it's gonna be held together with the bell housing bolts. Now we're gonna install the pilot bearing. It's gonna go right in the back of the crankshaft here. Gonna give it a couple of taps to get it started. And then we'll switch to just a regular race driver. We'll drive it all the way flush with the back of the crank. That's it, that's done. Feels really nice. Okay, now we're gonna install the flywheel. We've cleaned this up. They usually ship with some kind of oil on them to prevent them from rusting. We've used brake clean and we've got all that cleaned off. And now we're gonna install it on the engine. So we're just gonna simply place it over the pilot area on the back of the crank, and it just walks right into place. There shouldn't be any resistance, and you should be able to turn it and line up the bolt holes. We've got that in place, and we're gonna add a little bit of medium strength thread locker onto our bolts and thread them in place. Okay, so now we're gonna torque the 6 flywheel bolts. They are a 17 millimeter. To do this, we have Clint holding the front crank pulley while I torque these.
So Clint is on the crank pulley bolt with a 19 millimeter socket and a 2-foot breaker bar.
The torque is 80 foot-pounds. Okay, we're all good. All 6 of them torqued at 80 foot-pounds. Now we're going to install the clutch assembly. We have the friction disc and the pressure plate. The pressure plate also comes with oil on it, so we've also cleaned that off with brake clean. First thing to install is the friction disc. Some of these are marked. This is the ASN and it is not marked. You can see the difference side to side. So this big hub side is gonna go out into the pressure plate like that. So this is going to be the flywheel side. So we're going to put this assembly together and put the alignment tool through there. Now we're going to put that alignment tool into the pilot bearing, and we're going to line this clutch up onto the dowel pin. See, there's 3 dowel pins. And I'm going to tap that into place as much as I can just to get it to stay on the dowel pins. And then we're going to thread these new pressure plate bolts in. See, while I'm doing this, that disc is still loose in there. This has got a little bit of wiggle room in here, so if you've noticed, the tool is favoring the bottom a little bit, so that could give you a problem when you're trying to get the input shaft to line up when you're installing. So as I start to tighten these bolts, I like to hold that up, just kind of eyeball center and hold it up near the middle. We're not going to tighten these all at one time. We're just going to kind of bounce back and forth and get a little bit of pressure on that plate. It doesn't move anymore, so we'll leave the tool in there and we'll just start working our way around. We can see that we're working this plate back to the flywheel. We don't want to just run it all the way down all in one shot. I think we're good to start torquing it now. Okay, so now we're going to torque these bolts. These 6 bolts are 14 foot-pounds. Okay, we're all torqued to 14 foot-pounds. We can now remove the install tool. I like to check it. Just make sure that there's absolutely zero resistance, that it just in and out really nice and smooth. This one does. So we're good to go there.
Before we drop the motor in, let me describe the proper way you get your distributor back on your new motor. When looking at this crankshaft pulley, there's a notch in the crankshaft pulley, and that's a timing mark. And then you also have the timing mark behind. So when you get the notch on the crank pulley lined up with the 0, you're either going to have your number 1 cylinder at top dead center or your number 4 cylinder at top dead center. Because for every 2 full revolutions of this crankshaft pulley, your camshafts are going to do 1 revolution. So what you want is you want the number 1 cylinder at top dead center. The way you can determine that, you can look in through this distributor port, and you're going to be looking at this right here. When the number 1 cylinder is at top dead center, this dowel is going to be pointing at the 12 o'clock position. If it was actually pointing at the 6 o'clock position, that means you have the number 4 cylinder at top dead center. So you would want to turn the motor over, do 1 full revolution of the crankshaft pulley again, and then you would get it in the proper orientation, seen at the bottom that there's no dowel pin, letting you know that the number 1 cylinder is at top dead center. To make this clear as day for you so there's no confusion, we're now going to go over to a motor with the valve cover off to where we can show you without a doubt what you're looking for when you're looking in through this distributor port. So this is actually a double roller, but it's going to suffice to show you better what we're telling you you're looking for when you're looking through this distributor port. So you see right here, the pin is at the 12 o'clock position, letting you know you have the number 1 cylinder at top dead center. So when you're looking in through this port, you'll be able to see that there's no pin there telling you that you're at top dead center for the number 1 cylinder. If you happen to see the pin there, then that means you've got the number 4 cylinder at top dead center, and you got to turn the crankshaft 1 more full revolution to bring the pin up to the 12 o'clock position. You have to get the number 1 cylinder to top dead center so you can get the distributor in properly. Yota1 Performance sends the engines with the #1 cylinder at top dead center, but for whatever reason, if you moved the crankshaft while you were tightening the flywheel bolts or pressure plate bolts, or for whatever reason, and you got it off of top dead center, this is going to help you get it back to top dead center before you install your distributor.
Okay, now we're gonna replace the 2 exhaust donuts. So we're just gonna take the 2 old donuts off. We don't need these anymore. Just gonna clean this area a little bit, get any funky stuff out of the way. That looks pretty good. The pipe sticks up through the flange, you can see here, so we just set the donuts right over the top of that. So these gaskets are a high heat, like a big crush washer. When the exhaust manifold lands on there, it has a pocket that receives that, and this donut is gonna be smashed in between there. So now we're gonna apply a little bit of clutch grease to the splines, the tip of the input, and then on the clutch release ball. I'm gonna use this cheap little brush.
Is that a special grease?
This is a packet that comes with the clutch kits. The ASN clutch kit unfortunately doesn't come with grease, but we're working on getting some packets added in there. So I think that's good enough. Now we're gonna install the release fork and the release bearing. So I'm gonna just get a little bit of grease on there. May not need it, but I'm gonna put some on there anyway. And then I got a little bit left on the brush, so I'll just rub some in there too. But this spot is gonna ride on that ball, so we already have the ball grease, so we're probably good to go. And now we got this boot. It goes on like that. You can see how it's kind of angled. So you can see the angle in the transmission. So this kind of matches it where it comes out square. You won't be able to see this, but I'm gonna slide this back here and install the boot. All right, got that boot in there. We've greased the input shaft pretty lightly, but we got a decent amount of grease on there. And we've also greased this area back here where the release bearing is gonna ride. So now we're gonna install the fork. I'm gonna slide it through the boot and get it to engage. It clipped into place, you can tell because it won't pull out. I can feel the spring tension when I pull it out, and it's pivoting on the ball. So now I'm gonna pull it back just a little bit, and I'm gonna slide the release bearing in place, and I'm gonna get these clips right here to engage on the fingers. And you can't see it, but I can feel it back there, that spring engaged. And we're on the ball. I'm adding tension back here where the slave cylinder sits, and we're pivoting on that ball. Everything feels real nice, so I think that's good enough. Let's install this engine. All right, here we go, engine install. I really can't.
Go off to the side. There you go.
I'm gonna have to push work against that light bar.
You going sideways like you came out, or?
A little bit.
Little off center, I'm sure, depending on.
We had the fan on it when we came out too.
What's that like this? Bill, how's it being back there?
Yeah, it looks.
It's looking okay.
Everything should be fine.
Will we come down on the input shaft though?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we got to pull it forward. You got to go down more.
Go up to here actually, because we're gonna hit the mounts. So we got to put the transmission up in the air a little.
Yeah, let's get it. A little more, Clint.
Need to clock it.
I think you got to clock it a little more clockwise as you guys are looking at it.
Okay, let's try to lower it down some right
Yeah,
there.
down just a
Go
little
down
bit.
with the trans too, Clint. Not too ready. You're gonna hit flange over here soon.
A little bit more clockwise as you guys are looking at it. And now that's looking better.
How far away is the gap?
Mike, it looks like the gap's a little bit higher on the top. It's got to nose up a little bit. Okay, that's looking more even.
It's nose low here.
Yeah, pick up the nose just a little bit.
Rotate the crankshaft just a touch, Mike. See if you feel splines. I think the trans needs to come down just a touch. Careful.
Oh, they got it. Okay, you got the stutter line for the starter.
Go up with the motor.
I'm gonna keep pressure forward.
Yeah, and I'll keep the trans up too. Keep going. Right there, right there, right there. Come down.
Yep.
Stop.
Right
You're
there.
good right there.
Buttermilk's not lined up.
We're good though. So now the exhaust is in, so we're okay. So now we can just work it back.
Yep.
So we got the engine aligned. We have the stud for the starter through the hole of the backing plate on the back of the engine. And now we're gonna jack the truck back up in the air and push it into its final position with it up in the air, a little bit easier for us. One little helpful tip in aligning the engine with the transmission is have your manual transmission in gear, and then this way the input shaft isn't gonna be turning while you're trying to align the input shaft into the pilot bearing on the back of the flywheel.
And you can turn the motor too by hand a little bit to change the splines if they're hitting.
Yeah, it is nose high, top high. That's better line right there. That's good.
Solid or still uneven?
It might be a little bit high on the top now. Right there.
Okay.
I think that's good right there.
This exhaust bracket being in the way, it's kind of hindering that ability.
Mike just got lucky with that hole, didn't he?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. It's like, yes, that was lucky.
You call me Magic Mike. Okay. So to get the bell housing and engine aligned at least a little bit closer, we're going to attempt to slightly thread in these 3 and 9 o'clock position bolts just to give us an even mating on the two surfaces. Finger tight just to see if they even start.
When you get the bell housing pretty close to the back of the engine and the starter stud is through the backing plate, one trick is that if you get a couple of the bell housing bolts, one at the 9 o'clock position, the other at the 3 o'clock position, and that's gonna assist you drawing the transmission to the back of the engine. The key is you don't use a lot of force. You get on there with a very small ratchet with very little mechanical advantage. You give a little bit of a turn on one side, get a little movement. You go to the opposite side, you give it a little turn, and at any point you feel a lot of resistance, you know you're not properly aligned, and stop and reset and rethink what you're doing. As long as it's slowly driving in with very little force, you know you're properly aligned, and you can keep on going back and forth, a couple turns on one side, a couple turns on the other side, to where you slowly draw the bell housing up flush to the back of the motor. We got the transmission snugged up to the back of the engine. You'll notice there's a little bit of a gap here. And what Nick just said is sometimes the best bet is to loosen this bracket that's attached to the engine block to where you can get this bracket first snugged up to the bell housing, and then you go back to those and torque those. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna loosen the bolts that attach this bracket to the block. Make sure this mating is right first, and then tighten the ones on the block. Now that we have the transmission mated up to the back of the engine, we're going to get the rest of the bell housing bolts started. We're not going to be able to properly torque all those bell housing bolts because you can't get a straight shot. And when you torque something, you need a perfectly right angle to get the torque spec proper. So some of these bolts we're going to be able to torque exactly to the 53 foot-pound spec. Some of them we're just going to have to go by feel and use our torque elbow and our best judgment tightening those ones. In particular, those very top ones that you have to come over the top of the transmission with a long extension and a wobble socket. In order to have an easier time to get the bell housing bolts aligned with the support bracket, we loosen the two 14mm bolts here. Now you can see we have enough play and we were able to get these two bell housing bolts started.
Okay, now we're gonna torque these two bolts and the two support bolts on each side going into the block. The torque spec is 27 foot-pounds on those. And I like to torque the two from the transmission into the support bracket first, and then do the sides of the block. And on the exhaust side, you can really only torque one. You can't get on this one right here that's behind the pipe, but that's okay. We'll get that one nice and snug. Now we'll go back with a wrench and get this one here that we can't get the torque wrench on. That feels about right. Okay, so now we'll reinstall the 2 upper bolts. One thing we are gonna have to do is, since we use this bolt here to get the engine and transmission mated, we did that because it's one of the easier ones to get to, but it really goes through this bracket as well. So now that everything's mated and we have other bolts holding it tight, we're gonna come back and now remove that bolt and put this bracket in place, and then we'll reinstall that bolt.
Right now you're seeing us get one of the upper bell housing bolts started. We're able to do that by getting our arm in there because this rig has a body lift. If your rig didn't have a body lift, you're probably gonna find you're gonna have to use the same technique you use to get the bolts out by coming over the top of the transmission with a long extension and a wobble socket to get those bolts started. Now that it's started, we're on that bolt with the long extension and wobble socket, and we're gonna get it cinched up snug. Same thing with the other side of the engine. With the body lift, we're able to reach up in there and get the bolt started. And then we're gonna come over the top of the transmission with the long extension and wobble socket and get it cinched up tight.
So I'm reattaching the exhaust bracket now. Now we're gonna install the 3 nuts that attach the exhaust pipe to the manifold. If you didn't get a hardware stud kit, at minimum get at least 3 of these. You can get them on our website. They're a genuine Toyota part. You can get them at any Toyota dealer. We'll provide a part number for that, but at least these 3. I've seen a lot of these nuts vibrate loose because you can see they got a little crimp in them. So it's a lock nut. So at least these 3, and we're gonna install these now.
There, you got it. You got it flush.
Now we're gonna torque those 3 nuts we just put on, and we're gonna do 30 foot-pounds right there. It's 26 to 30. We're gonna go with the higher end of that. I have an extension on it, so I'm probably not getting a true torque reading, but I'm getting up to 27. We're in range. I don't want to put too much on it. I just always kind of figure, I just translate it into what happens when I'm using an impact gun.
And you lose torque off.
A ton. I mean, how many times have you like, oh, it won't come off. Oh, let me get rid of the extension, and it comes right off.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that you don't know until you try it, and once you get used to the rhythm of it, you kind of feel the torque in your hand actually, you know, so it's just a matter of being able to know what the limits are.
We're getting the engine mount brackets attached to the frame right now. What Nick is doing is he's assisting with a long pry bar, manipulating the engine in the way it needs to move to where Clint could get the bolt started.
It needs to go forward towards the course port. Bump it.
Huh?
Just bump it a little. Okay. Let it come down and back.
Down and back.
Almost. Put a little tension on it. Go up a little, up and back. You don't thread it. You just gotta feed it.
Don't have a lot of room.
What do I need to do?
It's gotta come down and towards the core support. Bump it harder. More. Then.
Go through?
Yep.
Okay, how's the other side left?
Pick it up.
We're going to install the starter now. I'm going to come up through here and simply put it over the top stud. And there you go, it's in place. Now we just need hardware. All right, that one's in there. This lower bolt, I don't know if you can see, this has the support for the clutch slave line where it turns from a hard line into a soft line, and Sometimes it gets a little bent up during the install, just like this one did here. So we're gonna have to just tweak this back into shape. Now we'll get a 14mm wobble socket and a small gun on that. I'm gonna leave that just a touch loose because I don't have the lower bolt all the way started. All right, I got a few threads in there by hand. Okay, the starter is tight. Now we might as well hook up the electrical to the starter since we're here. So this is our main power wire that goes onto this stud here on the bottom of the starter. That's a 12mm nut onto a copper bolt, so be careful not to over torque that just snug. And then slide the boot back over it. Just like that. This is the wire that comes from the engine harness. That's the starter exciter wire, and it plugs in right here. That's it, the starter's complete. Okay, now that we're done with the starter, we're gonna reattach the transmission harness to the engine harness. There's just 2 plugs here. Okay, that's complete.
How come this one gets left out?
It's just an option that this truck didn't have.
They build the harness, but they don't use the plug, huh?
Yeah, that's pretty common on these things. So now we're going to attach the engine ground. This engine attaches here, but there's several locations that it could be attached. We're just going to clean the paint off of that. Now we know we got a good ground. We're going to use a 14mm ratchet to attach this back to the block. Ground's done. So now we're going to reattach the AC compressor to the AC bracket using these long 12mm bolts, 4 of them. All right, we've got all 4 bolts started by hand, and now we're going to use a 12mm wobble socket and a long extension and come in through the passenger wheel well and zap them down. We might as well do the fuel line while we're here. Right there to the front side of the fuel filter. We're gonna do that with this banjo bolt and these 2 new copper crush washers. So we're gonna put one of the washers on the bolt, and then we're gonna feed the bolt through the banjo fitting and then put the other copper crush washer on it, just like that. And then we're gonna put that over to the filter. Now we're gonna come in here with a long extension and a ratchet and a 17mm wobble socket and snug that up. And that's it. That's the fuel line connection at the fuel filter. Okay, now we're gonna go after this engine harness. We're gonna run this down and get it back through this spot in the line right here. So we gotta be real careful not to tweak this line too bad, or the harness. So we gotta kind of be gentle here. I've got this stuff that needs to be out of the way, and we're gonna run this harness through here back into the cab. Okay, that's all the plugs through. So now we got to get this added electrical back into that grommet. So we got that back in there. Now we can start pushing this grommet through the hole. Can you get to that grommet and push that one little piece back at me? Yep, keep going like that. That's good, I got it. All right, now we got that grommet back in place with the harness through there. Okay, so now we're going to install the engine computer. This is a 3-plug computer. Some are 2, some are 3. So we're going to have 3 plugs that go into that computer, and then we're going to have 2 other plugs that go between the engine harness and the body harness. So this is going to be one of them. This is going to be the second body harness plug. Okay, we've got those in there. Now we'll plug in the computer, and each one of these plugs is unique. Okay, so we've got all that plugged in. Now we're gonna turn the computer, the plugs stay down. These 2 brackets are gonna go back against the floorboard, and then this 3rd bracket will bolt into the body panel here. So we're gonna tuck these wires back into their spot. There's a lot of extra wiring down here, so it gets a little tight. All right, now we're gonna get these bolts in this computer. So we've got the computer bolted in place. Now we're gonna put the kick panel back. So we're gonna push the carpet back in place. On here, there's this little pocket right here, and there's this tab that sticks out that just goes in there. And then there's 2 small screws that hold it to the side of the body. That's it. That's all there is to the computer. There's a couple of plugs we have to deal with here. This is the washer hose that's going to go up on the hood. We have a relay here. This is something aftermarket, probably part of the lighting. And then we have the injector resistor plug over here. This just fell off. This goes down to the fuel pressure regulator. Put that back on there. And then we have a hose dangling down here. That's the fuel return line. Get that pulled up. Just a big loop around, and it hooks right back here into the fuel return line. There's a bracket over here that we need to reinstall on the intake. We'll get this brake booster hose hooked up. It goes there. Just gonna use some bent needle nose pliers. They have this clamp that goes onto that booster hose, and then this is gonna come from the charcoal canister around, and it goes right here on the last port of the throttle body, and then into that 3-way clamp there. So we'll run the cruise control hose down, and that's gonna wrap around underneath that, right on that top port of that triple vacuum nipple. Now we're going to attach the throttle cable. That's going to go underneath this hose. It ends up with this little flared spot is going to end up hooking right into that clamp that's on this EGR piece. And I'm going to leave that out for now until I get this hooked up. I'm going to put this cable back in that hole, right through the slot, push it into the middle, and it'll come back around, and this bracket will attach back right here. Okay, now we're gonna reattach this clamp over here now that we've got the harness ran underneath of the AC line. There should be a captured nut welded to the body. This one's broke off, so we're just replacing the hardware with some JIS. It's a 10 mil head, 6 mil bolt with a nut. We've got Clint down below holding the nut. Tighten it from above. All right, I think that's good enough. So one last thing we're gonna do over here is connect the AC compressor. It's this little blue wire, comes out of the main harness. Real simple, just make sure it's plugged in nice and tight. There's this one last wire harness clip right here, and it attaches to the front corner of the intake with that front intake bolt. So now we're going to attach this cylinder head ground. The bolt is up underneath these heater hoses right here into the firewall. We put the bolt back for safekeeping, so we have the bolt. It's a 10mm head bolt. So now we'll connect the single wire oxygen sensor right here into the main harness. Some of you guys may not have this. You might have the O2 way downstream. Okay, so we're gonna now hook up these heater hoses. This is one of the heater hoses from the heater core over, and this is one of the rear heat. Goes right down into this coolant pipe. This is the one that wraps behind the exhaust manifold. Get our clamp up on the hose. Get that hose over the pipe and get that clamp in place. We got this final heater hose in place. We'll go ahead and tighten it up. So that's the final on the heater hoses. So now we're going to attach the alternator harness. A couple things here. This is the main alternator plug. This is the power wire that goes on the top stud of the alternator. It's kind of hard to see. It's tucked in down here behind the radiator hose. A stud right there on the top of the alternator. And then the final wire we have here is this one, and this is an engine ground. And this is going to bolt in down there. It's the uppermost forward engine mount bolt right there. When we get down there, we're gonna clean the paint off of that bracket and make sure that's got a good ground. And we'll attach the two plugs from up here, and then we'll go down below and attach that ground bolt. And this harness goes underneath this radiator hose. You twist it and you'll find how it goes, and then you need to listen for the click. Hear that? Hopefully you heard that. Okay, so now we're gonna tighten that 10mm bolt down there, or nut, sorry. Pretty small stud, so just snug, not much torque. Okay, now we're gonna go down below and put that ground on. It could be done from right here, but it's gonna be a little easier for me to do it through the wheel well. Okay, I got the paint off of that bracket. It's good clean ground. So now we're going to install the fan pulley, fan and fan clutch. This pulley's going to sit right over the water pump, and the fan's going to go right over the top of that. We're just going to spin this around and get all the nuts in place. There's 4 of them total. They're 10mm. I'm just gonna hold the pulley, do the best I can. We'll see if it works. Just tighten these. I'm usually pretty good at it.
You gotta have Magilla Gorilla grip strength to hold the pulley. You must use your left hand a lot.
So here we're going to install the fan belt. This is the belt closest to the back of the motor. We're using a Bando belt, part number 2345. Let's put this on there. Goes on the very back pulley.
It's also the alternator belt too, right?
It is, alternator and fan. I'm going to come right in there with the bar. That's another good reason for upgrading to this bracket. It's a great spot to tighten the belt. That thing pretty tight. And we'll go ahead and tighten up that top bolt. And now we got to go down below and tighten the bottom belt. And you can see how tight that is. It's definitely not loose, but it's not real tight either. I can get a good amount of pushing that belt. The lower pivot bolt of the alternator, it's 14 millimeter and you need a tool on both ends. Okay, now we're gonna put the steering pump back over onto the engine. So we had it just really gently set over here. Now we're gonna grab some hardware and get that bolted back to the head. We're gonna use a 14 millimeter box wrench to get down in there. Okay, so when you're bolting up this steering pump, since we have 3 bolts that go into this side of the head, and then we have 1 that comes into the front, sometimes all the holes may not line up. You might get these 3 in and then find that this one doesn't line up perfectly. If that happens, you can just slightly loosen these 2 and this bracket will flex independent. Then you can tighten that bolt there and all the hardware, and last thing, snug these bolts back up here and that'll lock it all back together. This bearing is a little bit dry. It's not horrible, but we have the bearing here and it's really simple to replace it. It's kind of a big deal if it goes out on you. So we're gonna just go ahead and replace this now, even though it's not horrible. We just loosen this front nut. It's already loose from us taking the belt off, but we're gonna take the nut all the way off. And then we're gonna leave that in there and take this whole assembly out. And it's important to keep track of how it goes. So the front of the pulley, the nut, a lock washer, this flat washer, that's the back side, this is the front side. So that's how that assembly goes. And then the snap clip is on the front. The center of it comes out too. So that's the back. So we're gonna leave this stuff right here. And we're gonna go replace this bearing. Okay, so now we're gonna replace this bearing. We're just gonna use a flat screwdriver. We're just gonna pop this clip out of here. Like that. Now we have to take the bearing out that way, so we grab just a regular race driver. It's gonna sit right there. So I'm gonna open this vise up a little bit. I'm gonna set the vise where it drops down in like that. We don't have to hit it very hard. These usually come right out. There's the old bearing. Now we're gonna put the new bearing in. We're gonna use a little bit of grease or oil. It's not side specific. It's the same bearing both sides, just a sealed bearing. Just gonna put a tiny bit of grease around there. Just get it to push in nice and easy. Just get it started. And then I've got this driver. That's it, knock it in until it bottoms out. And then we're gonna put the snap ring back in. Just like that. Beautiful new bearing in our pulley. Let's go install it. Okay, now remember this is the front of the pulley. We have our spacer that goes in from the back and then our backwards washer. We're gonna put this back on the tensioner bolt assembly and then add our lock washer and our nut. And at this time, there's no need to tighten that all the way up because we still need this loose for the belt. So now we're gonna put the AC belt on. It's a center groove on the crank. Now we're gonna go down below. We're gonna raise the truck up actually and tighten that AC belt. Now we're gonna put some tension on this belt. So 14 millimeter bolt on this one for the adjuster. I like that right there. So now we have to lock the front of the pulley down. Okay. That feels pretty good. So now we're gonna put the power steering belt on. This is the belt all the way forward, the third belt away from the engine on the crankshaft, the bearing we just replaced. Put some tension on there. Now we'll lock the nut down on the front of the pulley. That's a 19 millimeter nut. This was a 12 millimeter on this one. We're gonna do a couple things here. We're gonna replace the O-ring on the distributor, then we're gonna install the distributor and then install the wires. So first things, let's get the old O-ring off. This one's pretty flat. This distributor had a bunch of oil on it, so I'm sure that O-ring was leaking a little bit. A pick or a knife and just get underneath that O-ring. I'm just gonna cut it off. Then we're gonna install the new O-ring. Be pretty careful getting it up over the gears so that you don't tear it. And then just roll it down the shaft.
It's like putting on a prophylactic. You knew I was going there, huh?
I knew you were. Get it into the groove and then get some grease on that. Okay. I like to get a little bit of grease on that gear and a little bit more out on the tip of that. That's too much, so let's get rid of some of that. Okay, so now we've got the O-ring replaced and we've got some grease on the gears, the tip of the shaft, and on the O-ring. So now we're going to install the distributor. We've already confirmed the mark is on 0. We know that we're on top dead center number 1. So now we're going to install this distributor. So the easiest way to do this is to just slide this in, and we're going to look at this slot here. We've got the bolt in the head that we have to line up with. So before this engages, we're going to get the bolt hole right about in the middle of the slot, and we're gonna point the rotor directly up at 12 o'clock. And this is gonna be a little stiff going in because of the new O-ring, but you can feel right about the time it hits the O-ring is when this gear is engaging with the cam gear. Bolt hole in the center of the slot, rotor at 12 o'clock, and we're just gonna push it in. And you'll see the rotor's gonna advance a little bit, and that's exactly where we want that. Now we're gonna put our retaining bolt. Remember, this was the special bolt. It's full threads and it's got the large thick washer.
So on the distributor, my understanding is that that is now pointing at the number 1 to fire the number 1 cylinder, correct?
Kind of. Let's kind of go over that. This is number 1 right here, and look, see where that's at? See how it's right center of that clamp? See how we're not really right center of that clamp?
So it's just a little bit before it.
Right. So it's always going to end up pointed over in this general vicinity. But the way that we recommend everybody install the distributor is exactly how I just showed, with the bolt hole being in the center of the slot and the rotor pointed exactly at 12 o'clock, and just push it in. And when it engages with the gears, it'll catch and it'll rotate and it'll end up about right here. We could restab this distributor and I could show you that I could probably get it into another position. It might actually look like it was closer to the number 1 cylinder, but you would be a tooth off. And that's because of the way the distributor rotates and how wide this tab is right here. If you ignore this and kind of look, it's gonna start sparking right at this leading edge, and that kind of is at number 1. So that's the proper way to install that distributor. At this point, we've got the bolt just not even finger tight. We've got it to where we can still rotate the distributor. And this would be a time when we would also replace this distributor cap O-ring, but Timmy's already done that. So that O-ring's new, genuine Toyota part in good shape. So we're gonna reuse it. And another thing, we're not replacing any of these ignition components because they're all new, genuine Toyota. The rotor, the cap, the wires, everything's in great shape and it's all pretty new, so we're just reusing this stuff. This cap cannot be installed backwards. Notice how the ears are a little offset, and this is a genuine Toyota cap, so it even tells you the cylinder number. If you look down there on the cap, you can see the cylinder number, and then the wires do as well. They're marked. Makes it very easy. We recommend genuine Toyota ignition components. So let's go ahead and install this cap now. A nut driver would probably work better, but somebody handed me a flat screwdriver, so we're going with it. And that distributor's moving a little bit, but that's okay. We're gonna put a little bit of dielectric grease in each one of these. I've actually already done it, but I'm gonna show you anyway. So just a little bit of dielectrical grease in each one of these boots. And then we're gonna lay these wires in here and just push them onto the spark plug and make sure they're seated properly and move on to the next one. Hey, number 3. And that makes it easy. All right, those are all installed. These clips also are included when you buy these new genuine Toyota wires. Not these metal tabs, so if you're missing those, you'll have to buy those separate. But these 2 clips are included with the wires. And look how nice those wires fit on there. No extra slack. Now we're gonna bring these 2 vacuum lines over that go onto the power steering pump. So there is no correct order for these. They kind of come off of the engine that way, so I just like to keep the furthest one back to the furthest one back on the switch.
That clip broke a little bit.
Yeah, this clip's pretty broken, but there's a little bit of it left. It looks like it'll still work. So now we're gonna put the coil wire on and the distributor lead. So this is a Celica boot. Some guys have it, most don't. Was never offered on the trucks, but it's a neat piece. If you find one, grab it, definitely use it. I've always put these wires in here, the spark plug wire through the main boot, but Timmy brought up an interesting thing that he messed with, and he put the coil wire through this hole right here in the side of it. So I say we go back with that and see how it works. I never really was happy with how the coil wire came out of the boot. Definitely tight to get it through there. So now we got this coil wire pulled through this boot, and now we're gonna install the coil wire with it pointing down. Normally, if you didn't have this boot, you would run the coil wire up through here and it would come over with a couple of these other wires. But for this, we're gonna run it like that. We're gonna put that around there.
Look at that, fits like a glove.
I like it. We've got one more wire down here, which is right here. This is the distributor plug. Before we put it in the clip, we're gonna line up the tab and install that. And then that's gonna clip right into that. And we'll come through here with some zip ties and clean up this wiring. We got one more wire here. This comes off of the engine harness and comes over to the coil and igniter. We're just gonna plug that together, and we'll get some zip ties on this stuff here towards the end of the video. Let's move on to the front. We're gonna secure the shroud to the radiator while it's out of the vehicle. Some rigs you can do that, some you can't. Fortunately for us, this one we can. Now, these body lift brackets, we've decided that we're gonna attach these body mount brackets while it's out of the vehicle. I don't want those tight yet. So this probably doesn't apply to most of you, but we've got these brackets put on. They're just snug enough where they're not flopping around, but we can still move them. First try installing the radiator. Okay, so we've got the radiator installed now. We're gonna move on to upper and lower radiator hoses, get the intake tube installed, and get this buttoned up. Getting the upper radiator hose installed. Here we are installing the new Toyota air filter. Fits very nice in there. Now we're going to install the intake tube. Goes on just like that. Box seats down there, and there's 4 clamps, 1 in each corner. Last thing over here, we have to plug in the airflow meter. We've already got the retaining clip put back in place. We did that when we disconnected it. So it's as simple as just clicking it back in place. And aside from the battery and fluids, that's done top side. We're gonna raise it up and do the lower radiator hose, and we'll lower it back down and get this thing finished. All right, we got the lower radiator hose installed. We'll tighten up the clamps. That'll be good. Okay, let's lower this thing down, get a battery and some fluids in it. We're going to install the battery.
This is a sick strap mod for a battery that came loose.
Strap-on mod.
Battery seatbelt. So we're adding break-in specific engine oil. This is high zinc. It's required for the first 500 miles, and it's included with the engine purchase. So we put 5 quarts of oil in this engine. That's gonna put it all the way to the top of the full mark on the dipstick, maybe even slightly past. We do that to deal with any small amount of oil consumption that could occur during break-in. You can find more about our break-in instructions on our website, and you'll also get a break-in instruction sheet shipped to you with the engine. This is a spill-free funnel. They're available just about every auto parts store. We really like them. Keeps the mess down. It also really helps to keep track of how much coolant and water actually went into the engine. I like to start with the gallon of distilled water. We're gonna look for bubbles as the air and water trade places. When we see big bubbles, we know that the cooling system's tight and there's probably not gonna be any leaks. There's those bubbles we wanna hear. Okay, now we'll switch to coolant. We're gonna use the factory Toyota red coolant. You see how that was bubbling going down? That was a good thing. And this is concentrate. We wanna get a full gallon of this in there. We've already got about a half a gallon of water. This cooling system typically takes about 2 gallons. Tim's getting the battery all situated while we're putting in the coolant. This is the last thing that we have. As soon as that battery's done and we get a little more coolant in here, we're gonna go ahead and fire this up. One last thing we do have to do is raise this back up and fill the transmission. Since we replaced the transmission input seal, we drained the transmission to do that repair. And now we gotta fill that transmission back up with some fresh oil. We got it. Go ahead. So this is an adjustable timing light. I mean, if we set it to 0, it would work like a normal timing light where we just match 0, and then you have to use the timing gauge that's provided. But this one has the degrees built into it, so we can set it to the timing we want. When I say I want 6 degrees of timing, now the light will flash with the mark right at 0, but it's really 6. It's just using 0 for a reference. In case you're working with timing marks that aren't clear, like these are not very clear.
So basically a jumper is just 2 leads, and This jumper, you might find it right here plugged into your driver's side fender. You just pull it out of its plug and you're gonna hear the idle change as soon as I jump these. If you guys remember, we put a white mark on the harmonic balancer or crank pulley. He's directing the timing light at that harmonic balancer and looking at the white mark in relation to the timing marks. So he's looking to see that the white mark is right there near the 0 on that timing tag.
We're using 0 because we're using a timing light with the advance built into it. So it being on 0 down there, the timing's actually set at 7 degrees. If you're using a non-programmable gun, there's other marks on there. There's a 5 and an 8 and a 12, I believe. So we're shooting for right around 5 to 7 degrees on this engine. 5 is spec.
5 to 7 degrees before top dead center?
Correct. 5 to 7 degrees before top dead center.
To make sure you fully understand the procedure to inspect your timing and to adjust your timing, I'd like to go into some further detail to make sure you understand the process. When it comes to the jumper, what you're doing with that jumper, whether you have an 85 or 86 and the jumper is on the driver's side of the engine compartment, like on my vehicle, or the jumper port is on the passenger side where we showed you earlier in the video, when you jump those connectors, what you're doing is you're taking away the computer's ability to advance the timing. Without the jumper connected and using my timing light, when I direct the timing light at the harmonic balancer and I'm looking at the timing notch that we painted white in relation to the timing tag behind it, a properly timed engine with the computer enabled should be at 12 degrees before top dead center. But when you jump the connectors to disable the computer's ability to advance the timing, you're looking for a value of 5 degrees before top dead center. Now, you saw Nick use a value of 7 degrees with his fancy snap-on light. The reason why Nick chose 7 degrees is from his experience, a little bit of advancement over the 5 degrees suggestion in the factory service manual will give you better performance from the engine. With the advancement, a little is good, too much is not good. If you advance it too much, you're going to experience some pinging or what they call pre-detonation, and then that's not good for your engine. So it's not a situation where a little is good, a lot is even better. That's not the case with this. So a little bit of advancement over 5 degrees is acceptable. According to smog laws with adjustable timing, you can go 3 degrees either way. So you technically could go to 2 degrees before top dead center or as much as 8 degrees before top dead center and technically pass smog. I haven't tested that theory, but that's what Nick told me, that you can go 3 degrees of that suggested value of 5 degrees before top dead center and still be able to pass smog. With Nick's timing light, when he set that value at 7 degrees, that allows him to look down at that harmonic balancer, and he's going to be looking for that notch on the harmonic balancer that we painted white so we could see better. It's going to be lined up with the 0 on the timing tag behind it because that fancy snap-on light allows for that advancement, so you're basically just aligning the mark with the 0. When you don't have a fancy timing light like that, then you have to utilize the other hash marks on that timing tag as a reference. With this affordable timing light that I got from Amazon, and I wanted 7 degrees before top dead center, I would be looking at the timing mark on the harmonic balancer, the notch painted white, and I would be looking to see that that is lining up somewhere in between the 5 degrees hash mark and the 8 degrees hash mark. When you're standing in front of the engine and you're looking at that timing tag from this orientation, from right to left, it starts with 0, then it's a timing mark of 5, then there's 8, then there's 12, and there's one last one, and I think that's 15, but I couldn't really read it very well. But that's the way it goes: 0, 5, 8, 12, and I think the final one to the far left is 15. I would be directing my timing light at that harmonic balancer to see that the notch on the harmonic balancer is somewhere between 5 and 8, letting me know it's somewhere around 7. When it comes to the jumper that you use to jump the port so you can take away the computer's ability to advance, you can make your own. What I did here is I just took a couple spade connectors. These happen to be a shrinkable one where you heat it with a heat gun and it sucks onto the wire and it provides a really good connection because there's adhesive in here. These happen to be a 14 to 16 gauge one, and this is a perfect little jumper for the diagnostic port if you have an 85 or 86. When it comes to the type of jumper port you would see on an 87 or older, those connectors are a much more narrow connector. This jumper I bought from a company called Wits End, and I'll put a link in the video description. It's a real handy one to have. Like Nick said, you can use a paper clip or maybe just a regular wire that fits in there very well. But this type of jumper is much nicer to have. You're going to get a nice tight fit into those connectors on that port on the passenger side, and you're going to guarantee that it's going to make a good connection. So now what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to start my rig, I'm going to get my timing light connected, and I'm going to show you what you're looking for when you're looking down at the timing mark. When you're checking the timing, you want your engine at operating temperature. Basically, you don't want the idle kicked up when it's cold. You want it idling at its normal idle when the engine is warm. Somewhere from 950 RPMs or lower. Right now, my rig's idling at about 900 RPMs. So with this timing light, I only have one connection I have to make, and that's to go over the number 1 spark plug wire, which is right here. If your timing light didn't have batteries like mine, then you would connect up your positive and negative cables to your battery to give it power. So right now, I don't have the jumper jumped to take away the computer's ability to advance the timing. So when I look down there, I should see that the timing mark is lined up with the 12 degrees mark on the timing tag. Let's take a look. As you can see, counting from right to left, that white timing mark is lined up with the 4th notch over from the right, and that is lined up with the 12 degrees mark. It goes from 0, 5, 8, and then 12. So without the computer terminal jumped, I am at 12 degrees before top dead center. Now I'm going to jump the connector to take away the computer's ability to advance the timing. I'm going to pull it out of its little plug right here on the driver's side. I'm going to take my jumper, I'm going to connect it. As soon as I make the second connection, you're going to hear the engine idle slow down. To verify that you have the terminal jumped correctly and the connection is good, get back in your rig and look at the dash, and you'll see that the check engine light is flashing, letting you know that you do have it jumped correctly. So just verify that before you check the timing. Now you'll see that the timing mark is lined up with the 5 degrees hash mark on the timing tag with the terminal jumped. Now I'm going to show you how to adjust the timing by manipulating the distributor. I'm going to follow Nick's suggestion, and I'm going to put the timing at 7 degrees before top dead center. You grab a 12 millimeter wrench. I happen to be using a flex head ratcheting wrench, and I'm going to get on this distributor set bolt, and I'm going to turn it lefty-loosey and loosen it. It doesn't have to be super loose, but it's got to be loose enough to where you can turn the distributor either direction. As I'm looking at it from this orientation and I grab onto this distributor cap, if I turn it clockwise this direction, that retards the timing. Currently, I'm at 5 degrees before top dead center. If I turn it a little bit clockwise, you're going to hear the engine start to stumble and run kind of rough. It's almost like it's getting ready to die. I know I don't want to go that direction, but I just wanted to show you what that does to the engine idle when you retard it. It's going to make it a little rougher. So I'll turn it back a little bit counterclockwise, this direction. And then now you heard the idle pick back up and the engine is running a little bit smoother. So now I'm going to go back to the timing light and we're going to make our fine adjustment and get the timing closer to 7 degrees before top dead center. And right now that looks like it's about somewhere around 6 degrees. I'm going to turn it a little bit more counterclockwise to get that timing mark a little bit more in between the 5 degrees mark and the 8 degrees mark on that timing tag. Now the timing mark is in between the 5 degrees mark and the 8 degrees mark, a little bit closer to the 8 degree mark, which lets me know I have it pretty close to that 7 degrees adjustment that I want, and I'm gonna leave it right there. Now I simply tighten my 12mm distributor set bolt and I'm good to go. I'm sure this has a torque spec, but just use that German spec of Guten tight and you'll be set. After you lock down your set bolt for the distributor, double check and make sure your timing is still where you want it. You want to take out your jumper, put it back into the little grommet that it's stored in. If you have the diagnostic port on the other side, you just want to take the jumper out of there and close the little cap on the diagnostic port, and that's it. You just properly checked and adjusted your timing on your 22RE motor.
And so one important thing to note about this timing jumper over here is that this is where you'll find this on an 85 and 86 only. As soon as we get to an 87, it's gonna be in the diagnostic port over here on the fuse box. 85 and 6 is over there, 87 through 95. Same concept, just in a different spot. So if you're working on a 87 through 95 4-cylinder truck, the diagnostic port is over here. This is where you're gonna take away the advanced capability from the computer to set base timing. We have a little jumper we made, but a paper clip works, a piece of wire, nothing specific. We're going after E1 and TE1. Hopefully you have this diagram. If not, Tim, you wanna give them a good picture of that, so for the guys that lost that lid. We're just gonna simply insert the jumper into those two terminals, just like that.
So this one is TE1 and this one is E1. And that's it. You just go through the same procedure that Nick showed you with the timing light.
This is important too. On the 85 and 6, there's two plugs. There's a 3-wire plug. That's not the one you use. We're in the plug that only has 2 wires. There's actually 3 down here. There's one with 1 wire, one with 2, and one with 3. We're in the 2-wire plug, and it's jumped. Once we're done setting base timing, we just simply remove the jumper and install the plug back into the rubber grommet if you still have it. That's pretty much it for timing this engine. We're done burping the cooling system. So we're gonna take this funnel off, put the radiator cap back on, install the hood, and this is done. When you're using this spill-free funnel, this is a plug to capture whatever's in here. We'll usually go over into the reservoir, as long as it's not too much. This is already full, so we're just gonna get rid of this. You can see it leaves the radiator full. Now the cap's straight.
We're going to torque all the lug nuts to spec. I'm going to use 85 foot-pounds today. Maybe I'll use a different spec another day, but 85 is good enough today.
Depends on the day. Different day, different torque.
Different day, different way.
All right, we are all done with this job. You just watched us put in a brand new rebuilt motor from Yota1 Performance into my 85 4Runner. It was a lot of work, as you saw, but if you take your time and you're really organized, this should be something that any do-it-yourselfer can do, provided you have the right parts and the right tools and the right level of patience, because 9 times out of 10, something is going to hang you up, and you got to overcome that obstacle and then get the job done. I really want to thank Nick, who owns Yota1 Performance. I want to thank Clint, one of his employees that helped out with this project. I also want to thank Mike, who also helped out with this project, and I want to thank Sean for giving up his weekend to come all the way to Riverbank, California to help me film this sweet upgrade to my 85 4Runner. So one of the nice things about dealing with Yota1 Performance is not only do they build super well-built engines, Nick is a super cool guy. He employs really cool guys, so it's been just a win-win situation. It was very enjoyable working with these guys over the weekend. It was fun wrenching with them. These are the kind of guys that you would want to hang out on a camping trip, not Brokeback camping, but a regular camping trip. And, you know, these are cool guys. And so I would have to say, we've been running this channel for 5 years, and we've built some relationships with different companies. By far, my favorite relationship is now Yota1. I'm stoked that we built a relationship with Yota1. And if you are in the market for a rebuilt engine for your Toyota, SUV, or truck, I highly recommend that you consider them and give them your business. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean, and special guests Nick, Clint, and Mike. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mods and sick Yota1 rebuilt engines. Peace out and bye-bye.